They believed fear would end this story. They were wrong. For years after the Civil War, the night belonged to men in white hoods. They rode quietly, deliberately, convinced that terror alone was enough to control entire towns. Most people never saw their faces. Most people never fought back. But there was one man they completely misjudged. He did not look dangerous. He did not speak loudly. He did not announce his past. To them he was invisible, and that was their first mistake. Long before the Klan began riding through the countryside, this man had already survived something far worse, the battlefield. He had worn a Union uniform. He had learned discipline under fire. And he had returned home with skills that did not fade just because the war officially ended. After emancipation, many black veterans tried to build quiet lives. They married. They worked land that barely paid. They kept their heads down not because they were weak, but because survival demanded caution. This man was no different. To his neighbors he appeared ordinary. To the Klan he looked like an easy target. They had no idea who he really was. The night riders came as they always did. Horses first, then whispers, then threats designed to spread faster than bullets ever could. They burned fences. They left warnings. They wanted obedience, not confrontation. What they did not understand was that this man had already faced organized violence before. He recognized patterns. He noticed spacing. He understood fear not as something to submit to, but as something that could be measured. And while others hid, he prepared. Not for revenge, for survival. The Klan assumed their reputation would be enough. It always had then. They believed that history itself was on their side, that no one would challenge them, and that even if someone did, no one would remember. That belief was wrong, because this man remembered everything. He remembered commands shouted over gunfire. He remembered patience. He remembered what happened when men underestimated their opponent. The Klan came again, this time closer, this time bolder. They crossed property lines that should never have been crossed. They mistook silence for surrender, and somewhere in that darkness they lost control of the situation. What followed was not chaos. It was calculation. They expected fear. What they encountered instead was experience. This story was never meant to survive. There were no monuments built for what happened next. No official records celebrating resistance. Only rumors. Only unease. Because the Klan did not like admitting that one of their targets had been something else entirely. A soldier. And as this story unfolds, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The most dangerous person is not the loudest one in the room. It is the one you never bothered to understand. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The first thing he did was observe, not through panic, not through anger, but through habit. Years earlier, on battlefields far from home, he had learned that survival often depended on noticing what others ignored. Spacing between men, patterns of movement. The difference between noise meant to intimidate and silence meant to conceal. The Klan relied on fear because it had always worked. They announced themselves. They wanted witnesses. They wanted stories to travel faster than they ever could. But that night, something felt different. Their movements were sloppy, their confidence loud. They assumed no one was watching closely. They were wrong. From the shadows of his property, the veteran studied them. He counted footsteps. He listened to how commands were given and how poorly they were followed. He recognized men who had never faced disciplined resistance before. They were not soldiers. They were performers. And performers always underestimate the audience. For days afterward, he said nothing. He went to work as usual. He spoke when spoken to. He let the town believe what it wanted to believe. But quietly, he adjusted routines. Paths he once walked openly were changed. Lights were placed where shadows used to be. Lines of sight were cleared, not aggressively, but deliberately. This was not defiance. This was preparation. Midway through the week, the riders returned. They expected escalation. They expected panic. What they encountered instead was something far more unsettling. Nothing happened. No reaction. No movement. No visible fear. They circled longer than usual. They shouted louder. They tested boundaries that had once produced immediate submission. Still nothing. What they did not realize was that silence was no longer uncertainty. It was control. The veteran understood something the clan did not. Terror loses its power when it becomes predictable, and predictability creates opportunity. He began to anticipate them, not just when they came, but how they came, which routes they favored, which men lagged behind, which ones talked too much. They were creatures of routine, and routines can be studied. The clan believed themselves untouchable because they had never been challenged by someone trained to think ahead. They mistook history's silence for proof of dominance. But history was quiet because people had been denied the tools to respond. This man had not. Another night came. This time the riders split into smaller groups, an attempt to appear more threatening. Instead, it exposed their weakness, disorganization. They crossed into spaces they no longer controlled. They separated from each other without realizing it. They relied on darkness as protection, unaware that Dardas works both ways. No one in town heard gunfire. No alarms were raised. Only later did whispers begin. Men who did not return home. Groups that stopped riding certain roads. A sudden caution where arrogance once lived. The clan told themselves it was coincidence. They told each other stories that avoided the truth, because the truth was harder to accept. Someone was pushing back, quietly, precisely. And for the first time, the clan was no longer setting the terms of fear. They expected retaliation. What they were experiencing instead was erosion. Bit by bit, their certainty cracked. And as their confidence weakened, one thing became clear. They were no longer hunting. They were being studied. Fear has a strange effect when it stops working. The clan noticed it first in small ways. Meetings ended earlier than usual. Men who once spoke confidently began lowering their voices. Routes that had been used for years were suddenly avoided. Nothing was said openly, but unease spreads faster than orders ever can. They told themselves it was temporary, that resistance always faded, that intimidation simply needed to be increased. So they escalated. More riders, more noise, more displays meant to remind the town who held power. What they failed to understand was that escalation only mattered when the other side reacted emotionally. And this man did not. He reacted methodically. Every move the clan made gave him more information. Every show of force revealed habits, weak points, and overconfidence. They believed numbers made them stronger. He knew numbers made them predictable. One evening, as the sun dropped and shadows stretched across the fields, he noticed something important. The riders arrived later than usual. They were tired, less coordinated. Confidence had begun to erode. That was the moment he understood. The balance had shifted. They were no longer operating from certainty. They were acting out of fear, trying to reclaim something they felt slipping away. And fear makes people careless. He adjusted again. Not dramatically. Just enough. Paths that once felt safe no longer were. Signals the riders relied on stopped working. Men who separated from the group did not rejoin as quickly as before. No one saw what happened. That was the point. The town woke up to rumors instead of answers. Someone had been hurt. Someone had fled. Someone had disappeared from meetings entirely. The clan tried to control the narrative. They dismissed concerns. They claimed nothing was wrong. But silence had changed meaning. Before, silence belonged to the victims. Now it belonged to the perpetrators. They believed secrecy protected them. They were wrong, because secrecy works best when no one is watching. And someone was watching very closely. As days passed, the veteran felt something unfamiliar, not triumph, but restraint. He knew escalation could undo everything. Panic could expose him. Anger could lead to mistakes. This was not about domination. It was about survival. And survival required patience. He thought often about what the clan represented. Not strength. Not order. But fragility. Groups built on terror collapse when terror stops being effective. They cannot function without fear to prop them up. And now fear had begun to change direction. Men who once rode proudly now hesitated before gathering. Whispers replaced orders. Questions replaced certainty. Was it safe? Who could be trusted? Was someone watching? Those questions spread faster than intimidation ever had. The clan crossed fewer lines. Then fewer still. They did not announce a retreat. They never would. But the town noticed. Something had shifted in the air. Not peace, but possibility. And the veteran understood something crucial. History rarely records moments like this, because they do not look dramatic. They do not come with speeches or victories. They come quietly, in the form of fear losing its grip. And while the town would never speak his name aloud, one truth settled in deeply. The clan had expected submission. What they encountered instead was discipline. When power starts slipping, it rarely disappears quietly. The clan felt it in the way their authority no longer traveled ahead of them. Doors that once shut in fear now stayed closed out of caution. People watched instead of hiding, and that subtle shift unsettled them more than open defiance ever could. They needed to reassert control, not through whispers, not through warnings, but through a message so clear that it would reset the balance. The decision was made quickly and poorly. They chose a night meant to remind everyone who ruled the dark. More riders than usual. More noise. More certainty that overwhelming presence would crush whatever resistance had been forming. They believed they were ending something. What they were actually doing was revealing themselves. The veteran recognized the change immediately. This was no longer intimidation. This was desperation. He saw it in the lack of coordination, in the way orders contradicted each other, and how men talked over one another instead of listening. Fear had entered their ranks, and fear, unlike discipline, does not scale well. He did not rush. He did not react impulsively. He waited, because the most dangerous moment for any group built on terror is when it believes force will fix uncertainty. That night, the riders spread wider than before. The assumed numbers meant dominance. They assumed no one would challenge them openly. They were wrong, not because someone confronted them, but because someone anticipated them. Routes they thought were secure became liabilities. Men sent to intimidate became isolated. Signals failed. Timing collapsed. There was no single moment of confrontation, no dramatic clash, only confusion. And confusion is deadly to groups that rely on fear to function. One by one, riders disengaged not out of bravery but self-preservation. Men looked over their shoulders more than ahead. They questioned orders they would have followed blindly weeks earlier. The clan had crossed a line not geographic but psychological. They had exposed themselves to uncertainty. By morning, the damage was clear. Not in bodies, not in ruins, but in confidence. Meetings were canceled, plans delayed. Blame spread quietly among men who once trusted each other without question. Someone had challenged them without ever standing in front of them, and that terrified them. The town noticed the absence first. Roads once avoided became passable again. Nights grew quieter, not peaceful, but less oppressive. Fear did not vanish, but it no longer dictated behavior, and that mattered. The veteran understood something crucial in those days after. Victory was not about erasing the clan. It was about proving they were not inevitable. Terror groups survive on the belief that resistance is futile. Once that belief cracks, everything else follows. He did not celebrate. He did not speak. He returned to his routines just as quietly as before, because he knew something history often forgets. Real power does not announce itself. It changes what people believe is possible. The clan never admitted defeat. They simply withdrew, reframing silence as strategy. But everyone knew the truth. They had come expecting obedience. They left carrying doubt. And doubt, once planted, does not disappear easily. Somewhere deep in the night, a line had been crossed, and it could never be uncrossed again. After that night, nothing returned to what it had been before. The clan still existed, but it no longer moved with confidence. Their presence became cautious, fragmented. They stopped riding certain roads altogether. Others they passed through quickly, without stopping. Fear had changed direction. The town felt it in subtle ways. People lingered outside longer in the evenings. Conversations resumed in places where silence once ruled. No one declared safety, but no one obeyed automatically anymore. And that difference mattered. The veteran watched all of this carefully, not with pride, but with awareness. He understood that moments like these were fragile. Push too hard and everything could collapse back into chaos. So he did what he had always done best. He disappeared, not physically but strategically. He avoided patterns that could be traced. He resisted the temptation to confirm rumors. He let uncertainty do the work fear once did. The clan, meanwhile, struggled with something they had never faced before, a threat they could not identify. They argued among themselves. They questioned loyalty. They suspected informants where none existed. Groups built on terror rely on unity through intimidation. When intimidation fails, unity fractures. And fractures spread. Men stopped showing up to meetings. Some left the region quietly. Others distanced themselves, pretending involvement had always been exaggerated. The clan tried to regain narrative control. They spread stories blaming outsiders. They claimed the town had become unstable, but no one believed them anymore, because instability had always been their tool. And now it was turning inward. The veteran felt the weight of what had happened most strongly in the quiet. There were no celebrations, no recognition, only the understanding that something irreversible had occurred. A boundary had been enforced, not through speeches, not through mobs, but through restraint. He thought often about the people who never had the chance to respond this way. Families erased without warning. Men who vanished without resistance because resistance had never been an option. That knowledge stayed with him, and it shaped his choices. He did not want a legend. Legends attract attention. Attention attracts consequences. What he wanted was space for himself and for others like him to exist without fear dictating every decision. By the end of that season, the clan's influence in the area had thinned to shadows. They still claimed power, but claims mean little when belief disappears. People remembered not details but outcomes. They remembered that intimidation had failed, that certainty had cracked, that terror had limits. History would never record this properly. There would be no official acknowledgement, no marker placed on the ground, but something had shifted beneath the surface. The clan had crossed a line they assumed no one would answer, and they were wrong, because resistance does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits, sometimes it learns, and sometimes it simply refuses to behave the way fear expects it to. The veteran returned fully to anonymity. He lived quietly, worked, aged, but the space he helped create remained. And long after the riders stopped coming, one truth lingered in the town's memory. Fear only works when people believe it is unbeatable. That belief had been broken. Years passed. New families arrived. Old ones moved on. The roads were repaired. The nights grew quieter, not peaceful, but predictable. And in places like this, predictability itself was progress. The veteran grew older, slower, careful not to stand out. He never spoke publicly about what had happened. Not because he was afraid, but because stories change when repeated. And this one needed no decoration. Those who remembered didn't remember names. They remembered a feeling. The feeling that one night, power shifted without warning. That terror met resistance it couldn't intimidate. That something ancient and violent was forced to retreat. And retreat is something movements like the clan never forgive. They tried again elsewhere. Different towns, different targets, but not here. Here something had gone wrong for them. Their certainty cracked. Their myth of inevitability broke. And myths, once broken, don't repair easily. The veteran sometimes passed the land where it all began. Nothing marked it. No stones, No crosses, no records, just earth. He remembered the family not vividly, but truthfully. The absence they left behind. The silence after their lives were erased. They never returned. Their home never reopened. Their names were never restored. But the riders never returned either. That mattered. Not as revenge. Not as justice. But as interruption. Because history often moves forward only when something interrupts its momentum. And that interruption didn't come from an army, or a speech, or a mob. It came from preparation, from restraint, from understanding the enemy better than they understood themselves. The clan believed fear was permanent. The veteran understood fear was conditional. And once people see that, really see it, fear loses its grip. By the time he died, no one called him anything special. No one knew what he had prevented. No one praised what he endured. That anonymity was his final victory, because the story was never about him. It was about what happens when terror assumes obedience and meets refusal instead. History would continue to overlook moments like this. It always has. But beneath the official timelines and sanitized textbooks, stories like this still breathe quietly, shaping what comes next. Not every battle leaves ruins. Some leave absences. And sometimes the most powerful resistance is simply making sure something never happens again. So when people ask why certain groups lost power in certain places, why intimidation stopped working, why silence broke, the answer isn't always written down. Sometimes it walked away unnoticed. And that may be the most unsettling outcome of all. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments.